Great, thank you. Yeah, thanks to Luke and to all the other organizers setting this up and inviting me to come a second time. It was a lot of fun last time, a lot of fun this time. Really glad to be back. And I'll be talking first about some of my research on how people predict other people. I think it's really one of the central questions in social cognition. And then in the second half of the time that I have, I'll be taking you through a tutorial on representational similarity analysis. So the fundamental question which I've been trying to address in a lot of my research is the question of how a particular brain takes the information it has about another brain and at a particular moment in time and uses that to predict something about that brain at a future point in time. So if I know something about somebody's feeling or thinking or doing at a particular moment, how can I make a judgment about what they're going to be thinking or feeling or doing at some point later in time so that I can plan effectively? And recently, Samir and I proposed a multi-layer model of how this might occur. I think there are actually a lot of parallels, I think, for sort of setting up the idea of prediction as a really major theme, because I think, although we're a little less formal, there are a lot of connections between what she talks about and what we do. So the idea here is that these representational spaces, these low-dimensional spaces with sort of familiar psychological dimensions, like the power and the sociality and the valence of a person, or the rationality or social impact or valence of a state, are the way we organize our representations of these different social constructs, these things like states and traits and actions. And that within any particular representational space, the closer two things are to each other, the more similar they are. So for example, you could imagine a particular person occupying one point within this space, like Justin Bieber hanging out here, and maybe Kamala Harris hanging out quite far apart in that space because they're very different people. And these representational spaces also have a really important predictive quality, which is that proximity within the space predicts the likelihood of transition between any pair of stimuli. So for example, you could imagine a particular point in state space representing skepticism or worry, and a close point in that space being sort of fear, being a more likely transition, and a distant point in that space, joy, being a less likely transition. So this, the proximity in this space sort of describes the dynamics of other people's minds and actions. And so I'm going to take you through some work in the first half of the talk in which we try and establish what these dimensions are, how we structure our representations of these different types of social knowledge. And in the second half of the talk, I'll show you how they have this predictive quality and how that allows us to actually predict relative to a number of different ground truths, accurately predict other people's mental states and actions. So in the domain of trying to map out what our knowledge of traits and states and actions looks like, I'm going to take you through a set of 3 different studies which use some overlapping and some different methods to get at this question. The first one I'm going to focus on a little bit more is trait representation, because this is also an example that's going to come back when we get to the RSA tutorial a little bit later on today. So in this context, we're trying to understand what features, that is to say, what traits, what enduring qualities of people, in particular these famous people, people use to represent them. So whenever you think about one of these individuals, when you're trying to make some kind of social inference about them, what information gets called to mind and is represented in your brain. These particular famous people we chose through a pretty elaborate process to try and get the most diverse set of celebrities we could, diverse sort of meaning not just in terms of demographics, but in terms of sort of people's judgments of who is similar and who is different. And of course, there's a lot of bias in it still, probably most prominently bias in terms of the occupations these people have. There tend to be a lot of people with high prestige occupations and less sort of tax accountants, as you might imagine, amongst celebrities. But pace those sorts of concerns. This is about sort of the best set of celebrities we could get. The reason we focused on famous people is because they're really useful common reference points. They allow us to have different participants make judgments about the same set of people and sort of distribute our data collection across different sets of raters and imaging participants and so forth. We've also done some work with personally familiar others like friends and family we'll talk about today, but in a similar vein effectively. And what we did in this experiment was try and use dimensions from existing psychological theories to explain the way these individuals are represented. So for those of you in social psychology, a lot of these theories will be familiar. For those of you without this background, I'll just quickly go through the theories that we looked at here. So these included the stereotype content model. This is a model of how we represent groups effectively, or individuals from within different groups. It posits that people represent other groups along a couple of dimensions, warmth and competence, so whether you sort of like them or not, and whether you think they're capable or not. The five-factor model of personality, probably many of you know, is one of the more prominent models of personality, positing 5 dimensions: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. The model of mind perception posed by Gray and Wegner. This is the idea that the degree to which we attribute a mind at all to another agent depends on 2 features: whether they have the capacity for emotional or mental experience, and whether they have agency in the world. So usually adult humans are thought of as having both of these qualities, but you can also have entities that have maybe just one or the other. So for example, people think of robots and God as having a lot of agency but not too much experience. And they think of things like babies and monkeys and frogs as having, and this is a fetus, it's kind of disturbing, as having like a capacity for experience but not really any agency to enact their will in the world. And then finally, from the domain of face perception, Alex Todorov and colleagues model suggesting that there's sort of this 2-dimensional face space that accounts for most of the social judgments we draw from people's faces. The idea that we use these dimensions of trustworthiness and social dominance to make trait-based face judgments. And so we took the dimensions from these various theories, as well as a couple of others, intelligence and attractiveness, and put them into a factor analysis and boiled them down to sort of the 3 principal components which explain most of what's going on here, and tried to explain patterns of brain activity using these dimensions. So we started by having participants online rate the famous people on the dimensions of these various theories. Then we'd have a separate group of participants in the MRI scanner complete a social judgment task that looked a bit like this. On each trial, participants would see the name of a particular famous person, like Bill Nye, and some statement that might or might not apply to Bill Nye, like would like to learn karate, and participants would just make a judgment of how much they thought that particular person would sort of subscribe to that particular statement. So in this case, do you think Bill Nye would like to learn karate? And we tried to choose a very, again, diverse set of statements that would cover sort of the possible space of social judgments that people could be making. So this included everything from things like would like to learn karate, so like possible interests, to political opinions, to social opinions and judgments. And people would make repeated judgments of the same person, and we would simply average over each presentation of a given target person to generate a stable pattern of brain activity associated with each of them. The warmer regions you see here are the regions that have reliable activity associated with these different individuals. So it looks a lot like I think what we often see in social cognition studies, regions like medial prefrontal cortex, medial parietal cortex, temporal parietal junction, anterior temporal lobe, and some portions of lateral prefrontal cortex showing this reliable person-specific neural activity. So what we want to do is within these regions that have some signal related to people, can we explain it using the features derived from these theories? And to do that, in the paper we used a combination of encoding models, a bit like Alex Huth talked about earlier in the week, but much simpler because we're using the sort of temporally averaged patterns rather than the sort of actual neural time course, since there's not naturalistic data here. It's not really much interest in like the details of the timing. And we also used representational similarity analysis, which I'll focus on here, just because that's going to also be the topic of my tutorial. And basically what you can do is simply take the pattern within this set of highly reliable regions, correlate it across different target people, and then see if you can predict the similarity between those patterns based on the proximity on the dimensions of these theories. And this is sort of what we get here. So each one of these points represents a particular correlation from the representational similarity analysis. These labels here indicate sort of different versions of this that we did. So this is sort of like a multiverse analysis showing that this is robust to a lot of reasonable methodological variance of this analysis. And then you have bootstrap confidence intervals around them and permutation null distributions in the gray bars there. And you can see that a lot of these individual features from these existing psychological theories can indeed significantly predict the neural similarity between these different target individuals, between these famous people. So this is just the correlation, this is the RSA correlation between the neural pattern similarity and how close people are on each dimension in question. So for example, if the behavior isn't, so the behavior is, sorry, yeah, so the behavior in this case is just the rating of the 60 famous target people on a particular dimension. Yeah, so like if you, for example, rated Harrison Ford and Howard Hughes as being very close on conscientiousness, then those two people would be expected to have similar patterns of neural activity associated with them. And if you rated them as very far apart, you'd expect different patterns of neural activity. Yeah, exactly. So it's a second order correlation effectively between the sort of similarities of each. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, so they're effectively regions that have reliable signal associated with differences between the people. So it's the regions that have maximal sort of reliability across all 60 target people. Yeah, and again, they're just these sort of orange regions here. So we'll get a little bit more into the nuts and bolts of this analysis in my tutorial. But for the moment, I'll just sort of summarize this by saying that what we find is effectively when we factor analyze these results, there are three dimensions that seem to be structuring our representations of these people. The power or sort of dimensions like dominance and conscientiousness and competence of that person. The sociality of the person, basically the extroversion. And the valence of the person, so whether they're viewed as positive or negative. Yeah, so they're basically decoded from within all of the sort of orange regions here, effectively.
If you look at some weights or something, what is believed right?
What do you mean by that question?
So I don't understand neurally what is the hypothesis about which regions would be involved in one judgment versus the other. I'm not sure what I'm seeing here scientifically, that's why. I understand that it's decoded some similarities, but what is contributing? What's the mechanism underlying?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, we don't really, it depends what you mean by what the mechanism is. Are you talking about like which particular brain regions show like a pattern associated with?
Here is the representation of this kind of matrix here. Here's the representation of remarks here. Here's the representation of that. This combination leads to this kind of thing.
Right. So I mean, that's taking a very particular sort of prior on what the spatial scale is that this information is represented at. That like the information is sort of buried within an individual region. The hypothesis here is a bit. Sure, so we basically just have that latter part then, is the answer, that we effectively are looking within the social brain network as a whole, which people elicit more or less similar neural representations. We can break it down by individual regions in something like a searchlight analysis, but at the moment this is aggregating across the entire network.
There's no hypothesis on what's
It depends what you mean. Like, we're not trying to, there's no mechanism study here. This is not a mechanism study, this is a mapping study. We're trying to identify the dimensions of variation that seem to structure this domain. We're not trying to identify what leads to those impressions or what those impressions are being used for, other than for very generically that they're being called upon in this task to make social inferences. Yeah.
This is done at a group level, so you can gather some data and people data, or are you doing RSA?
So yeah, RSA is happening for each individual. Yeah, exactly. Those similar results if you aggregate. So we actually did the same thing with respect to the domain of mental states. Again, trying to map out what the structure of this domain looks like. And in this study, we started by choosing a set of 60 mental states, just words that are representative of sort of the broader domain of all the words we use to describe other people's minds in a given moment. We had them rated on the dimensions, again, of a large set of existing psychological theories. I won't go into quite as much detail about that. And then we used fMRI to elicit patterns of neural activity associated with them. So this is what that task looked like. People would see the name of a mental state like sadness, and a couple of scenarios we pre-tested to elicit sadness. These work really well for me. These aren't the ones we actually showed participants. I know. And then this would repeat again over and over across the course of the experiment, and we simply average using the GLM to get a stable pattern of activity associated with sadness or with any of the other 60 mental states that we were looking at here. And again, we can look to see sort of where the reliable information is in the brain associated with these individual or these mental states, and it's a similar set of brain registration.
Is there a lot of consistency amongst what situation people pick to represent that?
Which of the two? Yeah, you mean like. So we haven't analyzed that because this is it's a little bit tricky. Basically, these are very sparsely sampled from the possible domain. So like we actually don't have more than like a couple trials across all of our participants where people answered out any particular pairing. So there's not really much, we don't really have the right data to analyze that. We wanted to sort of have people making as many unique judgments as possible to sort of guarantee the generalizability of the results. So again, we can look within the areas that have sort of reliable signal associated with mental state representation, and we can either look at sort of the existing theories over here on the right, pairs of dimensions that have been advanced in the literature as being important for mental state representation, or dimensions that emerge from a factor analysis of all the dimensions in these various original theories. And we can see that 3 dimensions, all except for human mind, this is a standard error, not a confidence interval, all except for human mind are significant predictors of the neural pattern similarity in these regions. So again, a sort of a 3-dimensional structure emerging in the case of mental state representation, suggesting that rationality, so whether a state is rational or emotional, social impact, whether it's a highly intense social state or a low-intensity state, and valence, whether a state is positive or negative, seem to be giving structure to the neural representations of these mental states. Carolyn, you have a question?
Oh, it's just a clarification question about how you define the area that seems to be about reliability.
Yeah.
Reliability across subjects or responding to the different.
Sure. Yeah.
But assume like the voxel correspondences.
Right. So I glossed over that a little bit because it's a bit different between the 2 studies. So this is actually the earlier of the 2 studies, and it's a little bit simpler method. This is just a voxel-wise ANOVA across the 60 people, effectively. In the study I talked about first, it's a method that Talia Kunkel actually came up with, which basically measures the voxelized reliability across people, and then thresholds that at different levels and measures the pattern-wise reliability within each threshold, and chooses the voxel-wise threshold that maximizes the pattern-wise reliability, but again, all across participants. Yeah.
Do you think if you use like a different kind of alignment that might preserve or respect that different people may have different fine scale representations, you would see anything different? Or?
Do you mean like a different alignment, like a physiological alignment?
Oh,
Or?
I guess functional alignment or some kind of voxel selection procedure that relies on within participant information, the fine scale organization across people's different course scales.
Sure. So I mean, we are still using the fine scale information from each participant just within the voxels that are chosen at the group level. That's done largely for convenience, that we can point to a single set of regions that like we're looking within, because otherwise it's a little bit tricky. Well, if you do look at individual reliability, it's a pretty similar map, but obviously there's variation across people. We might see something slightly different there, but we haven't looked at that. Yeah. And the final case I'll talk about quickly is in the domain of actions. So in this case, we did something very similar to what Alex Huth has done, and use text-based features as a way to derive a possible set of dimensions organizing action space. This is largely because, unlike the domains of traits and mental states, there aren't a ton of existing theories about what people have advanced how this domain is organized. So this is just a toy example with fake data, but you're familiar, I think, with this method already at this point. The idea that you can look at the co-occurrences and recover useful semantic information from how words co-occur in a corpus. Here, the slight twist I just wanted to emphasize was that we looked at verb-noun co-occurrence, so the verbs here being proxies for actions, and the nouns being proxies for either the agents committing the actions or the entities upon which the actions are being performed. And we can simply do a principal components. Well, so there's, just to show you that this actually has some structure to it, if you zoom in on this hierarchical clustering, you can see that this really does group sort of similar or related actions together. So in this small slice that I pulled out here, you can see that these words, hopefully you can see, are all related to cooking in some way, to food preparation. So things like peel, chop, thaw, poach, sweeten, etc. And we simply pulled out an 8-dimensional solution which seems to explain a disproportionate amount of the variance here, and use those as features to try and explain the similarity between actions. Again, these are sort of a set of candidate dimensions. This is a testament how bad we are at guessing what these things mean. So all of these are guesses at what humans would rate actions as. So we had participants on MTurk rate a subset of the actions that we looked at on, for example, example, like communication competition or creation restoration and so forth, and tried to correlate it with the principal components that we extracted, which are on the x-axis of this graph. And basically, we tried to find relative matches for each of the principal components, and it took us a while, as you can see. So everything below this black line is sort of a failed definition for each dimension. We eventually got good ones, and this is not just overfitting, because we subsequently did a pre-registered replication with a different set of actions to make sure we weren't sort of overfitting to any particular set of actions or anything like that. And through some subsequent validation, we found that 6 of these 8 really seem to predict human judgments of the similarity between actions. And I mean actions here more broadly than just verbs. So if you use a bunch of action phrases constructed with the same verb, so there's no room for the verbs to be predicting anything, these dimensions are still quite predictive of human judgments about which actions are similar and which ones are different. And they also predict a lot of useful features of actions. This is out-of-sample prediction of a bunch of different features of actions. So things like who does the action in terms of their traits, why actions are done in terms of approach or avoidance motivations, what time of day they're done, where versus inside or outside, and how they're done in terms of body parts involved or in terms of the amount of effort involved. And we seem to be, far from perfectly, but quite robustly predicting all these features out of sample. So suggesting this is a reasonable basis set for describing a lot of the important real-world properties of actions. Scramble the tags.
Like, I don't know, inside private and just scramble the tags for the next one. I wonder about how noise would be and whether if you made a noise here, whether it would still find some correlation or not.
No, I mean, that's not mathematically possible here, right? Well, I mean, this is an out-of-sample prediction. So like, if you train a model on noise, then it just can't predict. Like,
But that's the question. Like, if you scramble the training set already.
Yeah, so I mean, these are significant if you permute things. If that's what you're asking. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the correlations were.
Are effectively 0. I mean, considered 0 for these days. Yeah. No. Yeah. And then finally, thanks to Janice Chen and being here last year to learn about her really awesome Sherlock data sets, we've been doing some neural work using that data set. We applied a temporal relation network, so this is a pre-trained deep learning algorithm that can label actions to basically get the probability of 332 actions, which you can't see here. But these are effectively how likely each particular action out of an enormous set is across the entire Sherlock movie. And then we can try and predict the neural activity associated with that. We can see that there's reliable neural activity in a very large portion of the cortex associated with these things. Obviously, in naturalistic stimuli, there's sort of a confound between maybe an abstract action representation and the visual part of the action. And what we wanted to do was try and predict within these areas the brain activity using an encoding model based on our set of 6 dimensions. So we can reduce the 300-dimensional space to our 6-dimensional space. We can train an encoding model on 4/5 of the data in all but one subject and then test it on either voxelized time course prediction or left out TR patterns in that remaining participant and the remaining 1/5 of the movie. And when we do that, we can see that our model, which we call FACTS, it's just an acronym, outperforms chance in virtually every single individual subject except for a couple who are not doing very well. We're not quite at the noise ceiling, to be sure, but this is a little bit of optimistic noise ceiling because it's based on a PCA of the actual movie data. A taxonomy which is explaining at least, a reasonable portion, though definitely not all of the variance associated with actions in the brain. Yes?
So, if I'm understanding, maybe I'm going to use the data together a little bit better, but it seems like in this model that the voxels that are most informative tend to be voxels along the ventral stream.
Mm-hmm.
That in the early work that you were presenting in Jesus lab, it looked like that was more like default motors. And so my intuition would have been that like the regions that are just driving people also would have helped integrate here, but
Yeah, so No, I mean, I think your intuition is largely right. Like, this network looks very different, I'd say, than the network we usually see when we have these more controlled experiments. And there are probably a couple reasons for that. I can't give you a definite answer because we haven't sort of systematically manipulated this, but my guess is it's a combination of the fact that this is a naturalistic study, unlike all the others we've done. So we don't make any attempt to control for the sort of visual associations between an action and what the action looks like. So that's probably a big part of it. The other ones are verbal tasks primarily, so we don't really see much going on in any part of visual cortex, which is good for sort of experimental control. But the other thing though is like sort of why is there missing activity perhaps in some of the default mode network areas, and that's a really good question. I've talked a little bit with Janice about this, and I think she has the right intuition here. That the pre-trained action label, action annotator that we're using is trained on actions that are about 3 seconds long. And the default network, especially in this sort of naturalistic data, tends to be sensitive to like pretty long time scales. So it may be that they were sort of annotating too fast for the default network to pick up on. And if we were able to find a good training set that had more extended activities, we might be able to see something a bit different in this. Oh, well, I mean, yes, but in that case, it's not naturalistic at all, so I don't think there is the same issue. So like, in that case, we create these stimuli, these mental state things which are sort of artificial. We're giving people words to describe states rather than allowing them to observe states in naturalistic data.
So there's a point, I think, in their data set where people talk about what happened. So if you compare the talking, or there's like other data sets, people are hearing somebody else talk about it. So supposedly, if you combine the data from watching it, hearing it, saying it, there should be something in common in the description that would not be just visual, because it's not constrained by the 3 seconds or the...
Right.
And then, did you try this just by masking just the regions you used in the other one?
So I can, so let me answer the first question is that you're absolutely right. That's a terrific approach, and that's what we want to do going forwards. We just haven't gotten there yet. The other question, we haven't run that exactly. That's a good idea to try it. You can see that you can see that there's some, exactly. But you can see there's some overlap. There's not a huge amount of overlap if you look at like where the encoding model is performing best. There's not a huge amount of overlap in the areas where it's performing well. So I wouldn't expect necessarily the default mode mask to do terribly well, but it's worth trying. So the work I've shown you so far can help us identify the dimensions which seem to give structure to our social knowledge, which allow us to understand people's mental states, their personality traits, and to some extent their actions. And the next question is effectively why, in some sense. Why do these dimensions and not others, or in particular, like what do these dimensions do for us functionally? How do we pay for the neural architecture that seems to be doing all this work for us and organizing things? And I think that the answer to that has to do with prediction, that it's very valuable to know what somebody's thinking, feeling, or doing next. Analogies in the game of chess, where if you can see more deeply into the future, that's very associated with higher skill. You tend to beat people who can't see quite as far out into future moves. And I think in both competition and in cooperation in humans, that if you can anticipate what somebody's thinking, feeling in the future, it's going to serve you really well. So we've looked at this in a couple of different cases. First, in the case of trying to predict other people's mental states. And then subsequently in some work which we're still putting together in how to predict other people's actions. So to begin with the mental state work, you might have an intuition that if you know people's emotions, it's pretty useful because you can use that information to help predict their actions. So if somebody's angry, they might aggress. If somebody is afraid, they might run, and so forth. And we can usually make reasonable inferences about people's emotional states just based on perception. We can use things like tone of voice and facial expressions, the context, and the things that they're doing to make a reasonable inference about how they might be feeling internally. Unfortunately, this sort of breaks down when you start talking about multiple steps out into the future, because I can't see what their face is going to look like tomorrow. I can't hear what their tone of voice is going to be next week. So this direct path from perception to emotion gets cut, and so I can't predict more deeply into the future what their actions might be. However, one way we could achieve this is by effectively bootstrapping up from knowledge of their current emotions to knowledge of their future emotions. So if there are regularities in how people transition from one state to another, and we can learn these things, then we can effectively use that to project what their future states might be and subsequently what their actions might be as a result of those states. Yeah, that too. So what we did was effectively try and see whether people had knowledge of these regularities, whether they could actively reflect on the transitional probabilities between emotions. And the way we did this was to compare the ground truth, which we got from experience sampling data sets, where we didn't do this. We used open science existing data sets to calculate the ground truth probability of various emotional transitions. And then we just asked participants on Amazon Mechanical Turk the likelihood of those same transitions. So if I tell you that somebody is feeling happy right now, how likely is it they'll next feel angry, or how likely is it they'll next feel tired or enraged or thoughtful or what have you. And what we see across 5 different studies is effectively what we see here an enormous amount of parallel between the experience sampling ground truth of emotional transitions and what people rate as being likely. And you might notice there's a lot of structure in this graph, and in particular this sort of like 2-block structure here. This is organized along valence effectively. And we can quantify that very precisely in this figure here. So this shows so these are rows, not p's, just to be clear. This shows the association between the distance on any of these particular dimensions, the distance on valence, for example, how far apart 2 states are, and the likelihood of a transition between those pair of states. So each point here is a pair of states. They have some distance between them on each dimension, and we have ratings of how likely that transition is to occur. And you can see in each of these cases, there's a significant negative association, though varying in magnitude, between the distance and the transitional probability. This is the property which I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, which is the further states are apart on these dimensions, the less likely a transition is to occur between them, whereas states that are very close together on these dimensions are much more likely to bounce back and forth. Does that make sense to everybody? Any questions about that? Yeah, so it suggests basically that this representational space that we happen to organize mental states in is very useful because effectively it encodes predictions of the future simply by encoding the position of the states. By knowing where a state is in the space, you know what's likely to come next. And we can also see that this information is encoded at a neural level. So this is a association between the transitional probability ratings I mentioned a moment ago. That's how likely people perceive a transition between a pair of states to be, and the neural pattern similarity between those pair of states. So the more similar the brain represents a pair of states within these regions, again, social brain network regions, the more likely it is that a transition is going to happen. And this might get a little bit more to your point, Ida, about sort of where in particular this has happened is actually very consistent, I think, with some of your data, that if you do a searchlight analysis really focusing in to see like what particular regions have the most information about this, it is sort of right up here in the most anterior part of medial prefrontal cortex.
Using that in Sherlock also.
That particular ROI. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, some of the, I'll get to some predictive results from Sherlock in a moment. You'll see, it's interesting. Another really nice thing about this study is that we used continuous carryover design. I think these things are underused, again, not naturalistic in any way, but very valuable because we can do both RSA on this data set and simultaneously repetition suppression as well. And so this is the result from a repetition suppression analysis. This is basically a contrast between the regions, between the sequences that are expected in accordance with transitional probabilities. So if we show you one mental state followed by another mental state that has a high transitional probability, or if those sequences are low probability in nature. And you can see that there seems to be this effect perhaps of updating in sort of a posterior portion of the precuneus. So again, some signals suggesting that there's this automatic predictive coding happening of other people's mental states. And this effect is in fact mediated by the 3 dimensions that I mentioned earlier. This valence and social impact and rationality all seem to matter. The next thing we did was try and do the same thing with respect to actions. And here's a little bit trickier because experience sampling studies tend to really focus a lot on emotions because a lot of them are very psychiatrically oriented and look at mood disorders. A lot less focused on actions. So we use a number of different measures to try and get at the ground truth of how likely actions are to transition from one to another. We used movie scripts on IMSDB, basically just sort of exponentially modeling the decay from a certain verb to another verb later in the script. We also used the American Time Use Survey. This is an enormous representative sample of Americans looking at diary days, where people basically list every activity they do for sort of the entire day, hour by hour. And we can use that to calculate transitional probabilities as well. We use WikiHow, which a little bit out there because WikiHow has some dubious content, in my opinion. These are, at least in theory, are sort of normative descriptions of action sequences. So from one step to another, what actions are present. And then finally, there's a nice data set curated by Google, this atomic video action set. This is used for machine learning competitions to train and test action classifiers on video. We didn't actually use the video in any way here. We actually just looked at the annotations that they put together because they have annotations of which actions are happening every 3 seconds across 15-minute videos, 192 of these. And with each of these, we could calculate a transitional probability matrix and see, when we asked participants about the likelihood of those same set of transitions, whether they could, again, accurately reflect on that. So this is just an example of what the American Time Use Survey transitional probability matrix looks like. You can see the structure here is a little bit more complicated than in the case of emotions. There are some more asymmetries as well. And you can see also that the diagonal is a little bit less sticky, so people are a little bit less likely to stay in the state that they're in, particularly for things that make a lot of sense, like traveling and eating. So it's pretty rare that you'll eat and then sort of complete that eating activity and then go somewhere else and eat more. That does happen, but it's a little bit less likely than transitioning into some other state. And similar for traveling. Usually you travel someplace and you do something rather than immediately start traveling again.
What about government and housing?
Yeah, that's that particular one doesn't occur very often, so it's a little bit noisier than the others. It's things like jury duty, voting, that sort of thing. Yeah. And what we find basically across all of these studies is that people can, in fact, very robustly predict the likelihood of these transitions. So this is just the Cohen's d for each of these studies across participants, showing that in each of them we're predicting, and this is, I should mention all these are pre-registered, so I feel justified in this mini meta-analysis here that we can say that there's somewhere between a 1 and 1.5 d-score, so a pretty enormous effect size that people are able to predict these things. I will say that at the individual level, the prediction is a little bit less robust than well, it's not less robust. I guess the best way to characterize it would be that everybody has a little bit of insight. Nobody has a huge amount of insight. So it's very consistent that people are giving ratings that are correlated with the ground truth, but nobody has ratings that are like exceptionally highly correlated with them. This is probably because we leave the time scale so vague here. We don't really give them a lot of context to make these judgments. We just say sort of somebody's currently chopping and then are next going to be, pouring. We don't really tell them on what scale that's going to be, and I think that makes it a bit harder for participants to do, but we wanted to give it sort of the minimal case. The other really nice thing we can do here is look at the dimensional mediation. So this is the same question we asked before, which is that if two actions are close together in our 6-dimensional action space, is a transition between them judged to be more likely? And if so, does that reflect an actual more likely transition? So what we can see here is, again, in each of these different studies at varying degrees, the proximity between states is correlated with increased likelihood of transition between each pair of actions is correlated with increased likelihood of transition between those pair of actions. And that's both in the ground truth and in the ratings that people make, and in fact it mediates that accuracy relationship between the two of them. So you can see that relationship illustrated here, for example, in the scatter plots. This is the group level that basically, for all 6 of these dimensions, if you just do this sort of bivariate correlation, there's this negative association between distance on a particular dimension and the likelihood of a transition. Finally, we returned to the Sherlock data set and basically reversed the encoding model we built a little bit earlier to create a decoding model. So what we do here is basically learn to predict the 6-dimensional position of a particular action in the action space based on the brain activity. then use that to predict the likelihood of any of the particular actions. And we can then read this out for a particular set of left out data. So I can tell effectively, based on your brain activity given TR, how likely is it you're thinking about an action in any particular part of this 6-dimensional space. And then I can use that information about where you are in the 6-dimensional space to make a prediction about the most likely action that will occur in the future. So basically, we can tell where in the 6-dimensional space you are at time t. We can make a prediction about what the movie will actually show at time t+1. And we are able to do this several sort of actions out for almost all of these different dimensions, suggesting that effectively by encoding, the brain is encoding these different dimensions, and by doing so, it's making a sort of reflexive prediction about what actions are likely to occur in the future. Any questions about that? It's a little bit complicated. Yes, this is an actions in this case. So basically, we train on sort of an entire run of an action, however long that happens to be. We decode that, and then we try and predict for the next run of actions, the next run of actions after that. So if an action goes on for multiple TRs, that's just one action. So that each one of these lags then is like an entire discrete action into the future. The length then is variable in terms of time.
And the bridging is using your transition property?
So it's effectively just reading out the position in the 6-dimensional space, and then the proximity from wherever we think you are in the 6-dimensional space to each action is the likelihood of that action occurring next. So any action that's like very close to that where we think you are is likely, and if it's very distant from that location, it's unlikely. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, again, some nice evidence suggesting that the brain is sort of reflexively encoding information about where other people are potentially going in the social future. So altogether, I think this model of predictive social cognition gives us a way of unifying a lot of existing theories about how we organize social knowledge, existing theories of state and traits, as well as some new theories of how action concepts might be oriented, and integrating them with a predictive coding framework to try and understand, why these particular dimensions are useful, why the brain sort of spontaneously seems to encode other people's minds using these particular sets of dimensions, and to achieve the social accuracy that we are. Going forward, we're really excited to try and start mapping connections between different domains. So how, for example, does the position of a person in state space predict the likelihood of particular actions, and vice versa. We're also trying to conceptualize how people build up their trait representations. We have some interesting evidence there suggesting that people are effectively sort of temporally aggregating across multiple states, that if you look at the frequency with which people are expected to experience particular states, that actually reflects a lot of the position of that individual in trait space. So with that, I'm going to wrap up the talk part of my talk and move on to the tutorial part of my talk. But first, I'll just thank my current advisor, Diana, my former advisor, Jason, my collaborators on a couple of the studies that you looked at, Juan Manuel Contreras and Miriam Weaverdick, the Princeton Social Neuroscience Lab, and the various organizations that support us. Thank you. Yeah.
So given the lab result that you showed with the action
Mm-hmm.
what I'm wondering is from like a engineering or information process perspective, what's the need to represent emotion information at all? If you can build an agent that can understand or observe enough information about transitions between actions, and then its goal is to ultimately predict future actions, what's the need to build in this hidden inference into the system? And then what evidence is it that people are doing emotion stuff at all if you're getting some of the same overlapping regions of the action prediction?
Right, so I think there's a great answer to this when you look at very simple model organisms, actually, so things like zebrafish, that there's a lot of information in sort of the action-to-action one-step lag of the zebrafish. But one way of encoding something that's at a longer time scale is by modeling the states that they're in. So if a zebrafish just swam left, you might know that it's next going to swim right or something like that. But if you want to know, like, is it doing food, seeking, then looking at the state that it's in across like a sort of a hidden Markov model of those particular actions is going to be more effective.
Couldn't you just get that from, like, I know where, like, maybe not like a zebrafish, I know that an agent is in the kitchen, so they're more likely to do, so now you get that information from, like, the context. So you can get it from the scene information or something about where they're located.
So I think that's just a different class of latent state. So you can imagine sort of another layer. This is actually one we want to explore in more detail, which is the context of the situation. Those probably predict sort of different things, though. Like I can be in different contexts and have different states, right? And those will interact, and those will make different predictions. So I think it's useful to model both of those. Yeah.
A basic question. So Sherlock encoding model.
Mm-hmm.
When you're doing the voxel-wise time series predictions. So
Yeah.
I remember Alex's stuff had, I think he fit some FIR model to account for dynamics. What do you do in that?
Yeah, so we didn't do anything that fancy. We just used the HRF, so it's probably not even as good as we could get it to be. Yeah. Yes. Either of you.
So I just wondering, like, based on your the trade state and the action things, is there any kind of like hierarchy things in there, or is that I think you are assuming there's some interdependency of each other.
Yeah.
The reason why I'm asking that is that if you go to another different country, people they sort of maybe the trade, the overall things they use is the same, but the organizational the things are very different. Is that going to change all the things later on? For example, it will change the state organization in your action. Do we think that is possible? I don't know.
Yeah, so there are a couple of really good questions there. One of them is about sort of the placement of the particular objects relative to the dimensions which are important. I think that's absolutely going to change across different cultures or different groups of people. So there's already good evidence for that in the context of the stereotype content model that, in most cases, if you go to a particular country, the warmest and most competent category are people from that country. And of course, if you go to a different country, that's going to change. So the actual positions of stimuli within the space are quite different. We're doing some research looking at that with respect to states to see how much cross-cultural variability there is in sort of the geometry of state representation. So I'll get back to you next year maybe on that. And then there's the question of whether the different layers have different sort of amounts of importance. I think absolutely there could be. So there's an argument that's been advanced that maybe traits are a little bit more predictive in individualistic societies, and in more collectivistic societies, maybe situations are a little bit more constraining of people's behavior. So this is a framework we could use to test that in a more formal way that's been done before, but I think it's a very similar point to what's been made before, yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, so have you noticed that you see more left hemisphere activation, right?
Yeah, so that's really interesting. We have seen that across a number of studies with our sort of more non-naturalistic experiments. And my suspicion throughout that was that it was due to the fact that our stimuli were presented linguistically, and it was sort of, and we used like right-handed people, and so the left hemisphere is sort of language dominant in most of them. And so there's probably some additional sort of left hemispheric activation for that reason, just because these things have to be loaded into the language system effectively. However, we've subsequently done an experiment, which I didn't talk about, but it's the same paradigm as the mental state study that I told you about, but using visual stimuli instead of text-based scenarios. And we still see the same left lateralization. Now, there's still mental state words on screen, so there's still some reading going on, but a lot less than before. So I'm less certain in that sort of explanation for why we're seeing that. It may be something more substantive, but I don't think we have a definite answer yet. Yes?
So if you want to reorganize a data point in a representational space with incoming information about the
Mm-hmm.
do you think it happens in a hierarchical fashion, or do you think something can move around in trait space without moving in action space?
That's interesting. So I think people use indirect cues a lot of the time to build up their high-level representation. So if you think about traits as a good example, I think traits are sort of built up based on sort of repeated exposure to people's mental states, but we also can form trait impressions very quickly based on like facial appearance, for example. And some of Alex Todorow's work suggests that that's an overgeneralization learning effect. That basically certain people have just sort of resting facial expressions that look sort of more like positive or negative facial expressions. And we overgeneralize from that to make impressions. So I think people can sort of if their priors are weak when they're just learning about somebody for the first time, they can use information that's not strictly speaking within the hierarchy to make some higher level inferences.